Thank you very much. And I'd just like to thank the organizers as well for having me here. I found this an extremely informative, very, very rich set of presentations and discussions, and I'll certainly be taking back a lot of this information back to Jamaica when I return. So to start off this panel, I'm going to give some specific examples of programs and barriers to implementation and opportunities to overcome from Jamaica. And just to orient you, here's Jamaica in the middle of the Caribbean, just south of Cuba and Florida, east of Central America, and north of Colombia. Jamaica is now considered a middle-income country. And in case you missed it, we're supposed to be a very high-violence country. And some of this violence has had homicide rates up to 60 per 100,000 for the entire nation, but really very focused in certain pockets. And the violence has been related to high poverty and extreme disparity in incomes, as well as high unemployment and underemployment. A history of decades of confrontational party politics, a great deal of drugs and gun trafficking, and powerful organized crime related to this drugs and guns trafficking. And in addition to this, a host of issues related to our criminal justice system, which I won't get into, but just suffice it to say, this is not an ideal criminal justice system in Jamaica. And just to give an idea of what it looks like, this is a graph of homicides in Jamaica over the last 30 years. And it started off high in 1982, but it has climbed and climbed, except for perhaps the last 3 years or so. There was a very impactful state intervention in 2010, which resulted in dozens of lives, scores of lives being lost in a very short period of time, but also subsequently perhaps a downward trend in our homicide rates. That's just as a bit of background. As you can imagine, as a result of all of this violence, there have been multiple projects and programs which have sprung up to address the issues of violence. Many of these are listed on our department's website, which has a database of violence prevention programs. And there's a lot of information available on the programs from the Coordinating Violence Prevention Alliance Jamaica chapter, which is represented at this meeting by Dr. Elizabeth Ward. You can get a lot of information from there, from her. As we heard yesterday, where you have a lot of programs and projects, many go about their merry way without any evaluations. And even of those with evaluations, there are even fewer with decent evaluations. I'm going to talk about 3 different programs which are quite different in targets and aims, and full disclosure, following yesterday's pattern, I've had input into either the implementation and or the evaluation of all of these. The Incredible Years is a brand name early childhood intervention out of the US, and this is really at project rather than at program level. The Youth Development Program is a homegrown second chance program for boys out of school, run by the Kingston YMCA. And the third is a community peacemaking effort called the Peace Management Initiative, or the PMI. So I'll start with the Incredible Years. And in Jamaica, our early childhood, in early childhood, most children go to what are called basic schools or their equivalents in private schools between ages 3 and 5. And the delivery is very school-like. They wear school uniforms and have teachers and so on. The Incredible Years program, the teacher program focuses on building good relationships with the children, with their parents, and a host of social literacy kinds of interventions. The child intervention focuses on teaching children similar social literacy kinds of things, understanding about feelings, managing friendships, managing anger, and so forth. This has been assessed using at least 3 different study designs. And the one I'll talk about here, just to give you an example, I'm not really trying to say that this is excellent, but just to show that there have been some benefits. This was a stratified, randomized, controlled study in 5 basic schools. 3 received the intervention and 2 did not. And this resulted in 12 or 15 classrooms being looked at, 60 to 64 children. So quite small scale. This was a pilot. And just to give a flavor of some of the results, in each case, for every rating looked at, what the program tried to do, it was successful in doing. There was improvements in the children's behavior, in their interest, in their helpfulness to others, and much improved teacher warmth compared to, in the intervention classrooms compared with the non-intervened. But my focus is not on the program or its results. That was just to give you background. It was on what were the program challenges and what were the responses. So the picture just shows an example, and this is from a parent training, where the implementer would take videos which were designed from the US, from the Incredible Years program, show them to the parents, and we selected vignettes which we thought would be reasonably appropriate. And they were used as the basis of a discussion to try to get parents to understand where they could change their responses. One of the major challenges was in participation for both teachers and for parents. In the US and in the UK, our trainers for the study were from the UK. They had quite a different experience in terms of parent involvement when the parents were invited to join the programs. Some of the issues that our parents in Jamaica spoke about, they had to go to work. They weren't just hanging around after they had dropped the children at school. Or they had other children to care for. Or it was too expensive to be transported to and from the school for the parent. Or they were in areas where the violence was so high that they were afraid to come out and go back. So some of the responses to this were that the implementers personally went to a great deal of effort to encourage the participation, whereas the program recommended telephone calls the day before to remind parents to come and participate. We would be telephoning and texting and ensuring that they would come through a lot of encouragement. We would provide stipends and refreshments, which were great incentives. We would provide transportation costs, and sometimes we would have security. For example, the groundsman for the school, we would pay him a little extra to stay on to ensure we weren't alone in a school implementing this where people were afraid. Or the teachers wanted to leave early to go home because they didn't want to be caught in this area late in the afternoon, coming down to dark. Another major challenge, and I think this would happen anywhere you had, you're trying to retain fidelity of a program from somewhere else, was a lot of the assumptions of the program were unmet. I listed here parent literacy. So there was a beautiful textbook the parents were supposed to have as a resource. It was targeted at college-educated parents. Most of our parents were barely literate, and this would have been completely wasted on them. But even the teachers who were literate, they didn't want to read their textbooks either. It was just too much work. We had to break down the information we wanted them to have and present it much more simply. Some of the program materials were just not suitable, even though we tried to select examples that were more fitting. many times this was still not appropriate. Other issues had to do with the classroom sizes. In the US and UK, the classrooms for this age group would usually have a teacher and a teacher's aide for perhaps 10 to 12 children. Or we had up to 30 plus children to one teacher, who therefore could not provide the individualized attention that was expected. The classroom structure, the 10 to 12 children in the pictures that we saw, there was a lot of room for the teachers to maneuver and have one-to-one interactions with the children, whereas in very small classrooms crammed on benches, that kind of physical structure didn't lend itself to the program delivery. In response, we had to create new and simplified and Jamaicanized materials, and this was a whole effort which was carried out. So a lot of adaptation was required for the environment. Other challenges had to do with natural disasters, civil unrest, and other disruptions. The very first pilot that we did, which was 3 months in one term, we had a hurricane, a separate flooding incident, sets of demonstrations, and other disruptions. So we had to accommodate, to adapt our delivery to accommodate these setbacks. We had to prepare in case there wasn't going to be any electricity, to have alternative program materials ready, and so on. Okay, the YMCA Youth Development Program, this targeted boys 12 to 16 years, and it was they were come to a school-like setting where there was focus on remedial education and again, social and life skills instruction. As part of a larger World Bank funded project, myself and colleagues Nancy Guerra and Kirk Williams and Ian Walker from the World Bank did a study looking at boys who were actually within the program compared to waitlisted boys. And we also went back to boys who had graduated from the program and compared them to comparison boys from their same communities. Using interviews, the Jamaica Youth Survey, we interviewed the boys as well as their parents. And just very quickly to say that both the current participants and the graduates showed improved social skills and knowledge, and very importantly, reduced aggression, both aggressive behavior and propensity for aggression. Challenges and responses. So as part, for this presentation, I interviewed the program developer and manager. And I asked her, tell me what were your major challenges? And every challenge that she listed had to do with limited resources. There were limited resources for staffing, so that the administration was the same staff that was delivering the program. There were plant maintenance issues. There were utilities issues. Every month she was struggling to pay the electricity. She had no fund to say, yes, she can be certain that this program would be continued into next semester. So sustainability was a big issue. But she was most bitter about unfulfilled promises, where people had promised to help support, and these promises just didn't materialize. And her response to all of this was just to continue requesting support from a number of different sources. And just a couple pictures to show you, holes in the roof and in the walls, lack of windows, plumbing issues, and it's a real shame. Peace Management Initiative now is a civil society organization, partners with the government and non-governmental organizations. And it's basically a violence interruption kind of program. One impact assessment carried out for the government of Jamaica said that a first step in volatile communities is often securing a ceasefire. And of all the programs examined, the PMI had the primary role and had demonstrated its ability to facilitate peace agreements. So just to give a picture of some of the improvements, for several communities, and some of this data is a little old now, but just to show what was happening, there would be an enormous shooting spree and reprisal killings, and then the green arrows show where the PMI came in, and what the effect was and how it was sustained over years. And here's another example. In this one, after the reprisal, after the intervention, we had very, very much lower homicides in Jonestown, Torrington Park. In Majestic Gardens, it was a little less dramatic. Again, very powerful in Rock Hall. In Woodford Park, we had good interventions, but it wasn't really sustained. In Mountain View, we had a good response, but it wasn't sustained. In fact, it became even higher after a few years. What are the challenges? Again, resources, a major issue. The same assessment said that PMI needed a larger and a predictable budget to expand its activities and strengthen the organization. For all of this work, we're talking about 4 field workers, and they were spread out over 60 communities within the Kingston and St. Andrew region. The current budget for programs and staff was about $32,000 US. When Chicago ceasefire visited, I think they were still Chicago ceasefire then, they estimated that what we required was a little over $1 million US just for field staff, not for program implementation. So we were working with about 3% of that. Another major challenge had to do with the national security goals, what the government was aiming for. For example, the present administration is focusing on legislation to deal with gangs and also in strengthening the police capacity, whereas the PMI was focusing more on taking delinquents out of heading toward community gang involvement and also supporting community development. So in response, continued lobbying, continuing our activities, strengthening the monitoring and evaluation capacity so that we could demonstrate effectiveness convincingly, and adaptation to new situations, adaptation to the declining homicide rates so that we were doing a lot more preventive work rather than response work. In conclusion then, common challenges were limited resources, a need for flexibility, and a need to align with policy and consistency, and the consistency of policies. And the responses have been continue begging, demonstrating our effectiveness, and adaptation. Thank you very much.
Kathy?